So just continuing with this theme, I'm not sure how effectively you can compare the time slices or look at the evolution, but just remember that temperature, precipitation, and humidity are the main drivers from the environmental side, and vegetation responses, desertification, are the main landscape changes we are trying to track through these 135,000 years to the Holocene. And we already looked at how broadleaf, needleleaf trees coverage changed around 122,000 years ago compared to 1800 in terms of aerial coverage, and this is how the shrub responded. So you can see that there is a loss of generally broadleaf around here, which was already gone by 135,000 years ago, and needleleaf also disappeared, which had seemed to replace broadleaf over here in the fronts and some patchiness here, but shrub takes over a lot of this area. So pastoralists and other practices, right now, but at that time it would have been hunters, gatherers. There was no domestication of animals as far as we know, and you can see the patchiness over here as well. And again, the grid point level information in the model, often there is a concept of so-called internal variability. In other words, how does vegetation respond just by competition between, let's say, broadleaf, needleleaf, shrubs, C3, C4 kind of functional types, even if climate is fixed. Okay, so if the model is given same radiative forcing fixed to some period, and temperature, precipitation are going to vary internally because of the so-called internal variability or non-linearity. So when we do climate change, we are worrying about natural modes of variability like El Nino, La Nina, monsoon, Pacific decadal oscillation, and so on, and their response on vegetation. And then there is a feedback between them as well, especially also through current cycle. Those kinds of things give you probably some response in vegetation, but here we are considering what we call forced response. So the radiative forcing over this time is being changed, and we are looking at vegetation response landscape changes to try to see if there are related signatures to how hominins responded during that time. Okay, so net primary productivity anomalies in Africa for C4 grass at 122,000 years ago, 120,000 years ago, 118,000 years ago relative to 1800. Average C4 grass net primary productivity derived from 122,000 year time series climate simulation performed on this UVic model. Red indicates lower net primary productivity levels compared to 1800, and blue means increase, obviously. So there are also the sites shown as before. So you can see net primary productivity 122,000 years ago, and C3 and C4 change, and 118,000 years ago. So you can see that there is basically patchiness of increase and decrease at the fronts, with some consistent decrease on the eastern side, with some indication that maybe there was a refugia created here. So we're looking at Lake Victoria here, Omo, Kwapse, Skul and Kwaps. I don't know how they are pronounced. I'm trying to sound Swedish with Skul, but maybe it's not Swedish. Mumba Shelter and Clazy's River here, and you can see how C4 also looks patchy, but it's maybe almost overlapping with C4's. Sorry, this is net productivity difference for 122 and 120. So this green part of increased part of net primary productivity in C4 has disappeared here. If I said something wrong before, just ignore it. Whereas here, this is persistent from 122,000 to 120,000 20,000 in terms of increases relative to 1800. C4 gas during 118,000 years ago, so we are transitioning from 122 to 118 here, and you can see that there is an increase in this band here between the Central African regime and the South African regime, and this remains here. So was there a spread from this into this direction? Was there reduced net primary productivity here, desertification, and how that would have affected population centers here, and pressures on the populations that would have been there to migrate out or disappear or do other things. So these are not easily mapped one-to-one, but it's easier to take the climate model and go through time slices in this way through MIS, marine isotope stages. Atmospheric surface temperature anomaly for Africa 116,000 years ago, 112,000 years ago, and land surface temperature anomaly for so precipitation, atmospheric and land surface temperature changes now 116 and 112,000 years ago. Atmospheric surface temperature and land surface temperatures derived from the 122,000 year time series simulation. So these are called transient simulations because it is a coarse resolution. It can be run for a long time, and they can make 100,000 year continuous simulation as opposed to doing slices of just MIS 6 and MIS 5A, B, or C, and so on and so forth. There are some differences in doing slices versus continuous simulations, which Axel Timmerman writes a lot about. Okay, so we are switching between climate change signal and its impact on vegetation change, and trying to conjecture on the resource distribution changes, desertification barriers or favored habitats, and so on and so forth. And we are also have to map these onto how megafauna would have responded, because that is another food source for the hominins at that time, right? 116,000 years ago minus 1800, atmospheric sea surface temperature difference shows cooling over here into the Atlantic Mediterranean region, whereas there is warming here. And you can see this transition from ocean to land following the boundary. That's not always necessarily very realistic. The models are running ocean model, land model, atmosphere model, which should transport heat and smooth things out, but there are couplers which do the flux over land, over the ocean, so you can see this looks a little bit artificial in that sense. So you have to be careful, especially here, how surrounding. So how the atmosphere smooths out gradients may not be well represented when you have such a coarse resolution. I just want to mention it as a caveat. Okay, so a degree, close to half a degree or more warming here, half a degree or less cooling here, but here by 112,000 years ago, atmospheric sea surface temperatures have cooled more than a degree here, which would have serious impacts on vegetation, humidity, acidification, etc. But the entire African continent seems to have cooled to various degrees all the way to the southern tip, even including Madagascar of the time, but the ocean is near neutral, maybe slightly warmer. So again, you have to be careful about these sharp transitions. Further, 116,000 years ago, land surface temperature difference shows quite a bit of patchiness. So this is atmospheric temperature and this is land temperature, which shows you how land atmosphere interactions modulate the atmospheric changes because of included vegetation change, carbon cycle, albedo changes. So vegetation can act as a soil moisture capacitor, for example, can hold the moisture for longer and prevent the rapid oscillations of the atmospheric or the land temperatures and so on. 112,000 years ago, serious change in temperatures here, massive cooling with some spots of warming, which have to be considered carefully as well. And there is the front that is always there even now between Sahara and Sahel, Sub-Sahel Africa and the transitioning into wet regions in the current climate, but there is cooling and warming happening here in a noisy sense as well. Obviously, you wouldn't want to take the model signals at this small scales necessarily as especially when you look at the archaeological sites at those particular spots. You tend to look for consistencies, what changed here versus here during this time, and whether that can be explained by this kind of patchiness in land surface temperature, associated precipitation changes, and so on. So looking at the precipitation anomaly for Africa then at 116 and 112,000 and 110,000 years ago, you can see that there are increases in these regions and decreases in these regions. Obviously, these are differences, so you have to be careful about how dry it was in a absolute sense. What kind of vegetation would have been supported here, and how dry and desertified it would have been here. Why do we always compare to another period? Because absolute values cannot be as valuable as comparing the differences as to what perturbations would have occurred at that time compared to what exists now. And see, like this is a massive wetting of the East African region, which had already transitioned to shrub, for example, broadleaf, needleleaf to shrub. So what would that have meant for either coming closer together to share resources and maybe having conflicts, or using the resources to be more adventurous and spread elsewhere, for example, along the gradients of rain. Here, this is for 112,000 years ago. You can see some drying happening, but some wetting happening here. And this is at 110,000 years ago. Some band of wetness remains, but you have more drying happening in these bands here, but more wetting happening here. So there has to be some consistency between the warming and the cooling in that sense in the model, because to get cooler and wetter in the low latitude regions is not easy, because in high latitudes cooler temperatures maybe bring more snow, because this includes snow in water equivalent. But at these latitudes, it's unlikely that snow is increasing. So if it was cooling and increasing in rainfall, you have to see maybe seasonality of the rainfall changed, more drizzle during winter, for example. And if it is warming and drying, then that would have a very different impact on vegetation as well. Okay, so let's leave that climate signal there over Africa and come back and look at how vegetation response would have been manifested based on those climate changes that we just looked at, from 122,000 years down to about 110,000 years or so. Okay, again, it's a narrative based on model integrations, but the model is validated with available data along the way. So just take it for the relative changes that we are pointing out and potential impacts on, say, hominins at that time.